my parents' attention was diverted, and somebody in the school, a predator in the school, an offender in the school, knew the situation, knew what was going on. So it didn't seem unlikely that he would take me out of class, call me his special girl, and sexually abuse me in his office. You know, 6th grade, 7th grade, 8th grade, the bullying was just awful. The male babysitter sexually abused me, and the friend of the family abused me. Like, I don't remember, as far back as I can remember, if there was anybody in the room that had some sort of perversion seed in them, that it would come towards me. But my doctor said that she did volunteer work with children, and she suggested Long Creek. It's the only jail for boys and girls under the age of 18 in Maine. So this was really different. I was sharing with these strangers in this interview process stuff that my closest friends did not know about. And in that sharing with them, they had an emotional response to it, and I was really taken aback by their tears. Like, why are you crying, And what I found out from them verbally and what I found out for myself experientially was they weren't used to a happy ending. That my story was something that they had hoped for the kids that they worked with, but something that they rarely, if ever, saw.
Catherine Ann Wilson, I've been waiting for this moment forever to have this specific conversation I'm going to have with you today. How are you?
Good. I'm excited, nervous, happy to be here.
Yeah, well, I'm happy too, because what we're going to talk about today is, to me, one of the most important subjects, which is in the world of not just human and sex trafficking, which is the world that you're in and protecting the children, but it really is, for me, most important subject here is child abuse prevention and what leads to that and all the education that comes around it. But really, today I want to dive a little bit more about your story, who you are, and why you do what you do. And you do have a story, and you do have an encyclopedia, and I really want to highlight your why, Catherine. So are we ready to go into that?
I'm ready.
Well, you have a foundation, Stop Trafficking US, and this started, I think, when you were around 50, right? So it's about 8 years ago,
yes,
right?
2015.
2015. Why don't you tell me a little bit about, and tell our audience a little bit about why you started a foundation? I mean, this is missionary work you're on.
Well, I had always done volunteer work. I believe in service, and I've always done it, but never really with children or teenagers. My childhood was difficult, and raising my own 2 children was a full-time job, trying to understand teenagers. So I was not compelled prior to just about 50 to work with kids, but my doctor said that she did volunteer work with children, and that really getting ahead of the abuse, getting ahead of what could happen to children with that domino effect was really important. And I really hadn't thought about that. And she suggested Long Creek. It's the only jail for boys and girls under the age of 18 in Maine. So I went through the process of the background check and all that and started volunteering there on the girls unit. I worked under the manager in charge of the girls unit, Beth Peavy, and I was blown away by a couple of things. First, even the entry, going through the background check and then meeting with the volunteer coordinators. When I met with the volunteer coordinators, for the interview, they had really personal questions, and I decided going in that I was going to tell the truth. So prior to that, any other volunteer work, my friends, I didn't tell my story to everybody. My past was a need-to-know basis, and unless you were my therapist or my lover, you didn't need to know. So this was really different. I was sharing with these strangers in this interview process stuff that my closest friends did not know about. And in that sharing with them, they had an emotional response to it, and I was really taken aback by their tears. Like, why are you crying, And what I found out from them verbally and what I found out for myself experientially was they weren't used to a happy ending. That my story was something that they had hoped for the kids that they worked with, but something that they rarely, if ever, saw a happy ending. So then I go into the building and I start working with the specific girls, usually 8 to 12 girls at a time, on a weekly and sometimes twice a week basis for anywhere from an hour and a half to 3 hours at a time. I think we called it a book club, but really it was like group therapy. And these were girls that were chosen for paths and willingness to be able to work with somebody like me. And every single one of them had been sexually exploited. And there was this term called sex trafficking that I had never even heard of before. And I wondered who came up with that term. But anyway, and as I'm working with these girls, I was just shocked that what had happened to me 35 years ago was happening, or had happened to like almost every girl in the girls group.
So 35 years have passed since you were sex trafficked, which you didn't even, that is
mind-blowing,
incredible to me, because you went through that process of being sex trafficked during a specific period of your teenage years, and you didn't know yourself that you were being trafficked?
No.
So you had never heard the term before?
No.
Oh,
no.
That is incredible. And not even after you escaped and recovered and thrived?
No, I
That's
thought that I had been a prostitute. And frankly, early in my life, after I had escaped, as I started the healing process, I was in individual therapy and group therapy. And in the group therapy, the women were actively angry with me because they saw me as someone who had been victimized, but I did not identify as a victim. So I'm in my early 20s, and I'm saying in group, I was a whore. Jesus forgave me. Through the blood of Christ, I'm forgiven. And I'm good with it. I just want these, night terrors and post-traumatic episodes and chronic panic attacks to stop. I don't need to say that I was a victim. I wasn't. I didn't identify as a victim until I was in my late 20s.
So that means, that's another subject in itself that we'll talk about, but you just brought up all the religious and the Christian background that you had, or the surroundings that you were surrounded by in terms of when you left that period. And they were saying that you had to be cured, or you had to be repented, or how did that affect you? Did you not believe them, or how did the religious side of things affect you in terms of how they judged what you needed in your healing?
When I escaped being sex trafficked, I was with my father when he passed away, the Cliff Note version. I moved where my mother and stepfather and siblings were living in Kansas, in the Bible Belt, Overland Park, Kansas. And I started, I was having panic attacks. And so one night I just looked on the Yellow Pages, and I called this place called Teen Challenge. And this lady picked me up and took me out for coffee at a place called the Village Inn Restaurant. And in the parking lot, I was telling her about my anxiety attacks and my panic attacks. I wasn't sure what they were. I didn't really understand them back then. And she said that that Satan had entered me and that she needed to perform an exorcism. So she put her hands on me and did this prayer. And I thought, this lady is nuts. And so I quit going to Teen Challenge. And when I had escaped prostitution, being sex trafficked, I started going to, a part of that was going to 12-step meetings. I just lied about alcohol, or didn't talk about alcohol, and went to the 12-step meetings because a family friend, Danny Singer, said that AA could help anybody. It was group therapy for me. So I stopped with the Teen Challenge thing and started going to the 12-step meetings. And there was a nice guy, and he was taking me to and from meetings. He never hit on me. He was kind. He had been sober for about a year. And my only value, the only thing that I believed I could give to another human being, was sex. I could be your dear Abby. I was great with, problem solving, and I could be sexual. And so at one point we were alone at his house, and I made a pass and we used a condom and the condom broke. And all that time of being on the street from 12 to 17, not being on birth control, never getting a sexually transmitted disease, never getting pregnant, I got pregnant. And so...
and you were 18
I was
then, right?
17.
17, okay.
Yeah, so a lot happened in that 17th year. So his family, part of his family owned a chain of Christian bookstores. And the other family were more farm, actually they were actually both farm families, but I started going to church. And, we weren't a church-going family when I was a kid. Occasionally, Easter or something we would go. But I had a good connection with a loving God who helped me escape and was there for me during really pivotal points of my life. But the whole, profoundly religious, fundamental religion happened when I was married. And I was listening to Dr. Dobson every day at noon on how to raise a family. And I was reading, I got all these great Christian books. And I wanted to be the best wife I could be. I wanted to be the best mother I could be. My therapist was a Christian. That group that I attended every week were Christian ladies. So it was a big part of that time in my life.
Great. Now, with that, leading to that, let's go to your childhood, because did you have any religious background in your family growing up as a child? And let's go back to the beginning. Like, how did you ever even got to the point where you were on the streets from the age of 12, and also being trafficked and in prostitution traffic? We'll go into that later. But how did it all start in this whole sexual abuse?
I think that it is important to note that my father was like 35, confirmed bachelor, and my mother was 17 when the two of them got married. So I just think that's a point of interest. But they were madly in love with each other, and I was conceived in love. I was born into love. I was the first grandchild. I could not have been more wanted or welcomed than I was. And that energetic and even biologic formation and entry into the world, I think, was really key to saving me later on. My brother was born about 19 months after I was, and he had an acute illness. He had asthma and spent his first 10 Christmases in the ICU unit in West Palm Beach for children. And pretty severe, the doctors would call my mom and dad and say, come and say goodbye to your son. He's probably not going to make it through the night. So when that was happening, it made me more vulnerable than normal. And I believe that all children are vulnerable. Yes, there are segments that are more vulnerable than others, but even middle class, family, people married in a great neighborhood, my parents' attention was diverted, and somebody in the school, a predator in the school, an offender in the school, knew the situation, knew what was going on. So it didn't seem unlikely that he would take me out of class, call me his special girl, and sexually abuse me in his office.
Now, when...
First grade.
Oh, yeah. So you were about 6 years old, right? 5
Yeah.
or 6 years old.
Yeah.
Yeah. When you just said something about vulnerability at that age, I mean, and how do you define vulnerability from a child's perspective? Because you said that at that point you were most vulnerable, you felt vulnerable. How did you feel, like, seeing that your brother was ill and he needed your parents more, right? So did you feel like second best at that point? Did you feel like you were not worthy? Like, what did you feel?
I was so little, I was a bedwetter at the time. Now, was I a bedwetter because of being sexually abused? I don't know. I don't really remember, but I used to have nightmares that, bad people were coming to get me, and I was a bedwetter. I was different than the other children, and again, just to be transparent, I was fainting when I was a little kid, and my mom and dad took me to the Boston Children's Hospital, and they said, this is some form of epilepsy, but not epilepsy. We think that you shouldn't have any more children. She's highly intelligent. We think that her brain is short-circuiting her body and she's fainting. So don't have any more children. Invest in education for her, and don't spank her. Don't whatever. And my mom and dad said, no, we're going to spank her when she's bad. We're not going to give her any sort of medication, and we're going to have more children. So I don't know where the nightmares and the spankings or the feeling different came from, but that was certainly sort of part of that soup at the time of my life. My grandmother, my father's mother, absolutely adored me, and I felt absolutely loved and adored by her. Absolutely. And until she died at 99 and a half, I felt absolutely loved and adored by that beautiful woman. My mom and dad were distracted. I mean, their little boy is potentially terminal, and so their attention was on him. I didn't really notice. I noticed they were gone a lot at the hospital. I noticed that toys that I would have liked to have had were given to him, stuff like that. But that's just little kid stuff. I just felt like I didn't belong in this particular world. Like I don't remember ever feeling as a kid, and even for most of my adulthood, that I belonged in this world. I felt just sort of like I love God and God's cool, but I think that God made a mistake in the time and place that He put me. Like I was a visitor from another planet and I'm not supposed to be here. That's sort of how I felt.
I remember in part of the story that you had told, and I remember the detail when you had said that you felt like a burden. And
yes.
When did that start, that you started feeling like a burden?
I think when I was 10, we moved from one house to another house, a nicer neighborhood, still in West Palm Beach, Florida. And I was a bedwetter, and the neighborhood children would do sleepovers, and my dad would say, you can't spend the night over at anybody's house because you're a bedwetter, and we don't want to burden them with you and you being a bedwetter. So it was just this, my mom and I never heard my mom and dad yell. There were no alcohol or drug abuse in the family. We did get spankings. My brother got more spankings than I did. But we did, my parents were very strict. The rules were unusual for that time. My dad did all of the cooking. He did the grocery shopping. I went with my dad. The kids, we did the cleaning. We washed the dishes. We helped set the table. We did a lot of work. We had a lot of chores. There was a strong work ethic. We had a business in Maine on a pond, small pond in southern Maine, where we had cottages that were just 5 feet off the lake that we rented, weekly. So my parents, we lived in Florida for most of the winter, but we would leave maybe a month or so before school actually got let out and drive up to Maine and get everything open so that when people would go on vacation, we're ready for them. And then we would have to close up camp, so we would go back down to Florida to go back to school about a month or so after school had already started. So if I wasn't sort of a misfit anyway, that sort of back and forth, great thing to do when you're an adult. I get it. I love it, But back when you're a child, you don't get to bond all summer with the kids, and then you don't get to start with the kids. And then my dad didn't believe in credit. Everything was cash only. So my clothes were hand-me-downs, or, everything was Sears and Roebuck or whatever. So I didn't have the same clothes as the kids. So all these different things just made me a little bit different. But I think that that in and of itself would have made me a target for bullying and all, that feeling of not really belonging. My parents loved me. They told me they loved me. We had routine. It was they fed us. It was a good life, but they didn't, and they loved each other, but they did not love me like that precious child. There was not.
So they didn't love you the way you needed to be loved then?
Yeah, it was just different. Like my grandmother, she adored me, she loved me. And my mom and dad, I just got the feeling that they loved me because they had to, not because I was beloved, I was precious, I was, like I am with my children and my grandchildren and the way my grandmother was with me. So there's all these little things that made that just sort of, set me up. But being sexually abused at such a young age, it's really hard for me to look back and it's the chicken or the egg, what's the deal? In the 70s, it was just, I don't know if it was the time. And of course, the older I get and the more I speak with victims, the more I see that the only rhyme or reason is opportunity, But the male babysitter sexually abused me, and the friend of the family abused me. Like I don't remember, as far back as I can remember, if there was anybody in the room that had some sort of perversion seed in them, that it would come towards me.
So basically, from the time you got the first time you were molested by that school administrator, did you already feel like an outcast before that, or did all that?
I already felt like an outcast before that. I guess the best word to describe my early childhood was confused. I was confused. I didn't understand why the other kids, why I didn't fit in with the other children. I didn't understand why my mom and dad didn't show me affection the way my grandmother did. I didn't understand why even the kids in Maine. So not only did we have that campground, but we also had like a penny candy store. And I remember stealing candy, whatever, out of the store and giving it to the local kids so that they would like me.
So it's fitting in and then getting validated, or the significance, that was always an issue where you didn't feel like you were significant. And
I just didn't, you have your tribe,
Yeah.
You have the kids that, you guys are peers at no matter what age. If it's kindergarten, you have your friends. If it's first grade, you have your friends. And I never really had that. It was always, if I did have any friends, it was because, my mother called their mother and said, would you have your kids come over? And then the kids would come over and say, we're only here because your mother called my mother, or, whatever. So the bullying early, so sexual abuse was one thing, but the bullying and not fitting in with my peers, that was, extraordinarily difficult at the time. I didn't feel like there was really a good reason to stay alive.
Yeah. Once that happened, once you were taken advantage of or preyed upon by that administrator, did that sexual abuse go on continuously with him? And also, do you remember whether you even had the ability to voice anything? Because as a child, no matter how vulnerable you are, there's that need to express yourself, right? Did you tell anybody, or?
I don't, not with the school administrator. I don't really remember much of that time. I remember everything after that time, but that first time was really confusing for me. So we moved from one house to another. So that's first grade. That's one neighborhood in West Palm Beach. But when we moved to a different neighborhood in West Palm Beach, I went to a different school. And that school, fourth grade, Mrs. Davis, Willie Mae Davis, she was phenomenal. That was the best teacher I've ever had, even to this day. She was amazing and took me under her wing. And that school year, even though I didn't fit in with the kids, I actually still have the watercolors I did in her class. She got me involved in a dance group, and we were the performers for the Black Florida beauty pageant at the West Palm Beach Auditorium. You could see my mom; she was like the only white head in the audience. But she really made a big difference in my life for that 4th grade, and turned me on to creativity and made me feel special, like my grandmother did. And that had a profound impact, and I'm so glad that I had that time with her. The sexual abuse continued. I did say something about the babysitter, and the babysitter was just no longer the babysitter anymore. There was no conversation. There was no, people can't touch you, there wasn't anything like that with my parents. I just said, hey, this is what, this guy is doing, and then he wasn't the babysitter anymore.
Did he attempt to do something, or did he actually
He touched me.
Oh, okay.
He touched me, my vagina, and I tried to get out of it, even then, which is just so interesting, because that was a theme for me as a victim. So when I present as a victim and other survivors I know, it's hard for non-victims to understand. Why didn't you say no, and like hit him over the head and run for the hills or whatever? When you've been sexually abused at such a young age, that doesn't even cross my mind. I mean, it never crossed my mind to say no or hit them and run or whatever. It was try to get out of it. So I went and grabbed my dad's Playboy magazine and said to the babysitter, if you want to see what a vagina looks like, you don't need to see mine. Here you go.
And how old were you then? I mean, even then, the resource.
10. 10.
Yeah.
It was just, and that theme of, trying to get out of it, and then even a rape, and there's so many of the stories that you've heard of me trying to get out of being raped or being abused in some way, and if it was to no avail, and it was the sexual assault was going to happen, then how can you get through that sexual assault as quickly as possible? And for that would mean orgasm. How can you get this offender to have an orgasm quickly so that it's over and done with?
And at such a young age, what does that do? I mean, do you just become robotic after a while? I mean, because, I mean...
Well, you learn not to tell. So I started running away at 12. So, I was skipping school because of the bullying. 6th grade, 7th grade, 8th grade, the bullying was just awful, really awful. I remember in junior high school, the school administration, the principal, vice principal, guidance counselor, a handful of teachers gathered up the bullies, the kids who were, a year older than me, and they had a meeting because there wasn't a bullying program at the time, and they didn't know what to do. School property was being destroyed. Kids were taking their own feces and writing stuff in the bathroom.
About you?
About me. Mr. Quisenberry's science teacher has a big book, and there's a table full of books when you enter the classroom. You pick up a book, take your seat. It's a random book, just pick up any book. It's not your book, it's a stack of books. And every single page of this book that I picked up had my name on it, And so the teachers were just beside themselves. They didn't know how to help me. They didn't know what to do. So, a neighbor was picking me up after school and bringing me home because it wasn't safe for me to ride on the bus. It wasn't safe for me to walk home. Mr. Quisenberry, I saw the book and I ran out of the classroom, and Mr. Quisenberry I found out later, told the kids, you are destroying this kid. But they didn't really understand what what they were doing to me, the trauma that
Psychologically,
they were.
yeah. So there was no reprimanding. There were no consequences for
Well,
their
they
actions?
had this summit, and then they said, what exactly did Kathy do? And they didn't really have anything concrete. So they were just trying to like bring it out in the open and see what it didn't make sense. It sort of took on its life of its own. It wasn't like I did something, it was just like the thing to do was.
This is the time, though, right? It was the 70s, right?
Yeah.
And bullying, no one
They
no
didn't
one
know
knew
they didn't know
yeah.
what to do, and they didn't know how to handle it, and so they did the best that they knew how at the time. And they were like, yes, we'll stop bullying her. And then the biggest offender, Donna, we go to walk out of the summit room, and she said, we haven't even started. We haven't even started.
She said it to you.
Yeah, but, I mean, as we're leaving, this thing. So it was like, and I remember being in 7th grade and one boy in the class picking me up by my throat and picking me up out of my chair, holding me by my throat. And we both got called after school to meet with the teacher, and we both got into trouble. I didn't do anything. This, it was a black male teacher. It was a black male student. And I'm sure the black male teacher didn't want it to get out that this, I'm sure there was a color thing going on. I didn't realize that at the time. At the time, I just thought, I didn't do anything. He picked me up and was choking me to death in front of the class when the teacher was gone. So it was just the unfairness of things was confusing to me. So all I knew to do was to run away from it. And what began happening in that 6th, 7th, 8th grade time period was I started to become promiscuous. I longed for love. I longed for acceptance. I longed for belonging. And if I gave boys or girls sex, then for that period of time, however long that intimacy happened, I got to be held and talked to and got something out of it. And the repercussion was the girls don't want to be your friends during the day, and the boys say, don't talk to me outside of this, thing, or I won't come and see you anymore. Or one girl called me and said, I'm calling because I want to talk to you about this problem I'm having, but if you tell anybody that we're friends, I'll never call you again. So, and that was just norm. It was just crazy. And my parents, I was their first child. They have the sick brother. Then they had a baby, Stephen, who died at either 4 or 6 months old of crib death or something. And then they had my sister, and then they started having marital problems. So my parents are distracted, and they're hoping that me figuring this out on my own will build character. They didn't realize how deep all this craziness.
Was it obvious though?
It was obvious to neighbors. The kids and the parents of the kids were like, this kid's in trouble. But they felt like it would build character, and then I started running away, and I would run away to acquaintances' homes.
When did you start running away? 12, you said, right?
12, yeah. So I think my parents were divorced at 13, when I was 13. So it was really, trouble was happening when I was 12. And I would stay with acquaintances from school. I wouldn't call them friends. But where I would run away to, the parents didn't call the police or social services or anything, or even ask me, what's going on in your house? And what I quickly learned was that people who allow kids, adolescents, to come into their home and not call authorities, you're going from the frying pan into the fire. And that's when the brother, the uncle, the stepfather is, putting their hands over my mouth, dragging me out of bed, and sexually assaulting me. And if I tell on them, then I lose that place to be. So
Would you be there for a long period of time?
I could be there a week, I could be there a couple weeks, but as soon as the sexual assault started, now I'm either going to go back home or I'm going to go to another place.
And your parents didn't wonder why you were gone for certain periods of time?
Of course
without
they
coming
did.
home?
They would call the police and tell them I was a runaway. When my parents got divorced, my mother didn't do mother-daughter time with me. There wasn't shopping day or let's go out for ice cream, it's your birthday, or anything like that. My mom was a very young mother, and in the 70s, there was this Fabergé perfume commercial that said, I can bring home the bacon, fry it up in the pan, and never let you forget you're a man, kind of thing. So my mom was craving life. And my dad said, you can have life. You don't have to leave me to have life. Get a job if you want a job. Do, whatever it is you want to do. So my mom got a job, and so she was trying to fulfill herself while we kids were, kind of young. But she met somebody that was more affluent than my dad, where she thought she could have a better life with this guy. So she takes me shopping one day when I'm around 12 or 13 and says, I'm like, wow, I'm shopping with my mom. Yay. Like back to school shopping was Rita Singer in Boston. She would take me school shopping, not my mom. So I'm like, I'm shopping with my mom. And she said, I'm thinking about divorcing your dad. And I'm like, no, you're not going to do that. She said, okay, I won't. And I'm like, wow, that was easy. Okay, And then, within days, I'm putting away the clothes in my dad's closet. And I said, gosh, Dad, I can't, I'm trying to make room, to put your shirt in. And he said, well, I'll have plenty of room soon, Mom. Your mother's leaving me. And so my mom took the two kids and she moved to Boca Raton, Florida. And I'm like, we all can't leave my dad. I thought my dad was, brilliant. I thought my dad was Einstein. I thought I just thought he was the most brilliant, wonderful guy on the planet. And I thought my mom was awful, and I did not like my mom. I really did not like my mom.
Because of the separation or leaving, or just even before that?
Just even before that. Like, why is my dad doing all the shopping? Why is my dad, doing all of the cooking? Why is, I just didn't feel like she was treating my dad the way he should be treated. Right?
Let's go into that, because that's a really interesting what you talk about with the dynamics between your parents, because from what you saw as a child, everything was white, everything was beautiful. You didn't feel that way, of course, but you took the blame on yourself based on how you tell what happened, right? But the interesting thing is there was so much going on that you weren't even aware of.
Right.
And based on what you're saying, obviously with your mom not even sharing with you, she shared with you that she's leaving, but then you changed her mind, but it's because she didn't want to talk about it anymore.
Right.
So obviously she's not a communicator, but she's young, of course, but that did make an imprint in your ability to even understand what was going on.
My mom was very sexual. So my dad was like a dear Abby. Everybody came to my dad for problems. He had the answer. I did not notice him having peers as friends. He had people that were a little lower than him. I don't know how else to say that, but he was like the guy that they would look up to. He was admired. My dad was admired. Everybody loved Burke. He was a good guy. You never saw him cranky or anything. And then, except for Danny. Danny was his brother, Danny Singer in Massachusetts. They were very close. They were both electricians together. And my mom was very sexual. She was very flirtatious. She was very skinny and worried and sort of like a damsel in distress kind of energy. Mom needed to take a nap at dinner while dad was cooking, and then we'd wake mom up to have dinner with us. So she seemed more frail, even though she was working and went on to be successful with her work. But I remember being in Maine, and she's wearing this little see-through white bikini, and there's a couple of guys that have her wrists and ankles, and they're going to throw her in the lake. I thought they were assaulting her.
This was at your campground, right?
Yes, yeah. And so I'm crying, put my mom down, put my mom down, and I ruined her fun, and I was so upset that they put her down, and she came over to me and was just like, what are you doing? You're ruining my, my time, I felt like my mother was in competition with me, which just hurt me, I still don't really understand how a mother and daughter can be competitive of each other. Like, I have no breasts. How am I, I'm a child. How are you, competing? But if there was a guy around me, she would just sort of, hey, and a part of being bullied at school was the other moms talking about my mom mowing the yard in her bikini. And so they would call her names in front of their children, which just added fuel to the children bullying me. Yeah. And so it's this whole, thing. So that was just sort of a crazy, that was, mom and dad's dynamic. So when mom left, good riddance, somebody needed to take care of my dad, and I'm the oldest, I'm a caretaker, and I'll stay and take care of my dad. And what I was not prepared for, and my grandmother gave me a subtle warning, his mother, my beloved grandmother, came to stay with dad because he was alone, and I lived, it was the three of us in the house, and I wore some jammies, some full length, whatever jammies. And my grandmother said, dear, you should change into, and I said, what are you talking about, Grandma? And she said, your father may be your father, but he's still a man. And that was the craziest thing I'd ever heard of, what are you talking about? I would sit on my dad's lap and get a hug from him every night, as my brothers and sister, my brother and sister, we would sit on his lap at night in his recliner and get a hug before going to bed. We would wrestle his steel-toed boot, trying to get it, unlacing it and pulling it off and pulling off his socks, and we would rub his feet, and, we loved, and he would scratch our back, and that was so nice. That was so nice. And now mom's gone, and I'm, 13, 14, and I sit on dad's lap to give him a hug, and he has an erection underneath me. I can feel his erection. And I'm sitting on my dad's lap, and I'm feeling this erection underneath me, and I'm just heartbroken. I'm just heartbroken because now my dad is a man.
It's just unbelievable how you are not immune to anything. Like, it was just, you were vulnerable to every count of abuse, whether it's bullying, your family, your mom, and it's just unbelievable how much heartbreak that you had up to that age of 13. And this is the vulnerable time because that's when we hit puberty. Mm-hmm. So I'm just incredulous in terms of what you had to go through, but the power of just how you describe that teacher, how you describe your grandmother, the power of just being seen and heard, is so unbelievable, isn't it? I mean, if those two people in your life, I'm sure if there were anybody else, but it seems like 98% of the people were just hurting you, and then these 2 people out of 100, or whatever the case may be, just recognized you for who you were, but it gave you the fuel to keep going. I mean, how do you not go through the anger? Did you ever go through anger during that time?
No. And I remember one time I was in Maine and I ran away from home, and I don't remember where I went, but I came back, and a couple of detectives came to talk to me, and my dad had given them my goodbye note. Wrote Dad why I was leaving.
Like forever? You were leaving forever at that point, or just
yeah, I ran away from home.
Okay.
And I'm like, I'm out of here, and I wrote this note, and and then Dad told them, call off the dogs. I'm back home, and so they came to talk to me, and they pulled me aside to speak to me privately, and they said, your dad gave us the note that you left, and we cannot believe that he shared that note with us. It was so incriminating against him. And they said, just so you know, in the state of Maine, in a couple of years, when you're 16, you can become emancipated and be an adult. And I had never even heard of that word. So I was seen. Those 2 police officers saw my situation, and they validated me. So I have a handful of these little moments like that that just made me, help me think I'm not imagining this. It really is as bad, because that confusion, like, is this the world that we live in? Are other kids going through this? Like, what's the deal? And then these little moments, or when I tried to commit suicide, and I went to see a psychiatrist, and the psychiatrist said, you are a normal adolescent and a screwed up with screwed up parents. And I was really like, I couldn't wait to tell my dad that I was a normal kid, and they were screwed up parents, to which my dad said, I'm not paying anymore. You can't go to that psychiatrist. And,
you've got to be kidding
right, and
me.
the psychiatrist said, I will see you for free. And Mom didn't bring me anymore. But that little moment, these little moments in time where somebody saw me and communicated to me that it really was as crazy as it seemed, and that I wasn't as screwed up as I feared I was.
Yeah. Now, it's funny how when you're looking back and you never thought you were a victim, or even when you escaped, or when you were going through the healing, that you still refused that you were a victim, but you were clearly a victim.
That's common.
Yeah, it is.
And people, when people who are doing their healing work sometimes want to like push dragging up their past, and I'm like, you don't need to do that. You don't, in the world of moving from surviving to thriving, you don't have to, go dig up your septic system. You don't have to wallow in that stuff. What needs to be healed will come up on its own organically when the time is right. I could not have handled everything that I have been through with one opening of Pandora's box. Like that would have been horrible. So
because there are little boxes, those dolls that have the little dolls and the smaller
little Russian dolls.
Yes, that's right. That's exactly what it was, right?
Yeah. So when I had the aha moment that, I was 25, and I ended up in a situation where I was with one of the offenders, one of the friends of friends of friends, who would put their hand over my mouth and drag me, into the hallway and have sex with me when I was a kid. As a grown-up, I ended up in a room with him. There was other people there, and slowly people started leaving, and a normal person would have left with the crowd, and I stayed for whatever reason, and it was just he and I, and he exposed himself and said, old times, let's go, and I said, yeah, no, and left. And when it was just that simple little act of me saying no and walking out, and I had this thought that if I really was a whore and I'm not in Kansas, I'm in another state visiting, nobody would have known. And if I was really a whore, I would have had sex with him because that's what whores do. And nobody would have known. I could have gotten away with it like a good whore, right?
Speaking of whore, there's one story I remember you talking about, and this is a key story. I think your father was going out with a stripper at that time, and you were sold the idea that you would make a good call girl. Why don't you elaborate? Like, when did that, was that around the 13, 14 as well?
I will. So just to wrap that one thing up, when I realized that I wasn't a whore, when I left that house and I had that aha moment of I am not a whore, that was one of those moments in a lifetime that everything changes, because it was that moment that I realized that I was a victim. And I called my therapist and said, I was just in this situation, and she had been working with me individually and in a group for a year. I don't know, it was 18 months or something, and I'm like, I'm sorry, I'm not a victim, I'm a whore, and I'm not a whore, I'm a victim, right? And she was mad at me, and she yelled at me on the phone for putting myself in that situation. How could I do that? So I was done with her as my therapist, and everything just sort of went ching, 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 like everything just in that moment sort of came together, like
Everything connected.
it was like, I was a victim. Yeah. Oh my gosh. I mean, it was like,
You know what? It takes one vulnerable moment to actually acknowledge the truth, which is we are victims, right?
Yeah.
It's crazy, isn't it? But of course, you know what? That's why I think your story really wraps up a lot, because you can't possibly see that you're a victim. That's what's saved you through that time.
Right.
Right?
That's right. I couldn't. And when it was time, when I was healthy enough, then, just like being on the street, I didn't have panic attacks or post-traumatic stress episodes, night terrors, all that stuff ever on the street.
Yeah.
And my body stopped menstruating, so I didn't get pregnant, right? And this was right before AIDS, by the grace of God, right? So I got no sexually transmitted diseases, no pregnancy, no panic attacks, post-traumatic, anything, until 17 escaped. And then when I was safe, then my body, and all of the biology of trauma began, but still not the mental understanding that I was a victim. Just the panic attacks and anxiety attacks and night terrors and, awful, my husband would try to be intimate with me, and if I got into a certain position that my body recognized as a position of rape that I had previously been in, I couldn't breathe, I would stop breathing and, pull him off of me. I would collapse on the side of the bed on the floor, go into a corner, go into a ball where I was safe, and I just rocking and hysterically crying. And I did have one of those episodes at a treatment place. I went to a place called the Meadows in Wickenburg, Arizona in my 40s, and I was in a group session, and the leader of that group got his PhD with veterans of war, post-traumatic stress. So the people who were in my group were people who had post-traumatic stress. And I'm listening to a woman talk about a rape. And I had done so much healing work, so much therapy by that time. So it was interesting that this happened because I'd done a shit ton of work, right? And so I'm in this group for anxiety, and this woman's talking about a rape, and I feel it starting to happen, and I don't want to, such a people pleaser, I don't want to intrude, disrupt, be a burden. She's having this therapeutic moment about her rape. How do I get out the door without being a burden and causing trouble? And while I'm trying to get my head wrapped around that, the post-traumatic episode grips me, and I fall to the floor, and I'm on my hands and knees with these grown-ups, hands and knees crawling to the door, and the teacher, the therapist, is like, if you can stay in the room, please try to stay in the room. Can you hear me? You know, knock on the floor if you can hear me, you know, to see if I was still emotionally able to connect with the reality of now, or was I too much in the other place that I was having the episode about.
Well, like you said, right? It's like the Russian dolls, right? When you've removed one layer, there's another layer there to work through,
Yeah.
and I think all the buildup of all those layers really, if you had to define one period of your life, a range, right? What range would you say was the most impactful towards all that trauma, like the most intense period of your life?
This particular moment, I had my back against the wall, and I learned to do a technique where I'd say, right here, right now. I am right here, right now. I am right here, right now.
Anchoring.
Right? And it took about 15 minutes for me to come back into the room. And the instructor said, I got my PhD in this. And he said, all of the war veterans I have ever interviewed, you have the worst case of post-traumatic stress I have ever seen in anyone. So I wanted to tell that story just to let you know, like, how bad that, you know, I had it. And that never happened. I mean, that happened twice. In my 40s and 50s, I only had that happen 2 more times, where that was a regular thing. Over time, it was less and less and less, but I didn't have to dig for trauma. It would come up, I deal with it, it'd come up, I deal with it, I come up, I deal with it. So are you asking what therapeutic things were the best?
What traumas were the worst period, like those traumatic years? Was it 3 to 10, or was it, do you have any period that you would say that you were anchored in that trauma? Because there is that moment in time where you just go deeper, right?
So there was a time while I was being sex trafficked that I was supposed to have a date with a hunter at a really nice hotel in Portland, Maine, and there was a group of hunters that were there, and other sex trafficked, prostitutes, sex trafficked victims were supposed to meet me, and we were supposed to have sex with these 5 hunters. Well, none of the other girls showed up, and the men didn't care, so they took turns on me. That time, or the time being pick different times of being raped, none of that traumatized me as much as my dad making a pass. You know, when my dad said, we were in Maine, and I had a bed up in the attic, and the stairs were those fold out, you pull the string and the stairs come down, and I had slept late, I guess. Dad was making breakfast. I come down the stairs, and there's the stove, and Dad's making bacon and eggs, and usually there'd be people there in Maine. It was very social, so the campers would come in and have coffee with Dad in the morning. In this particular morning, there was nobody but Dad, and I was coming down the stairs, and Dad stood at the bottom of the stairs and looked up at me, and he said, I understand you give good blowjobs. We don't have to have intercourse, but your mom's gone. How about helping your old man out? That was more traumatic to me than, anything else. One time Dad got crabs, and he had me go through his pubic hair and pull out the crabs.
How old were you here? Around 14, around that time?
Yeah. Something. So those things, Dad asking me, we're in the grocery store, and Dad asking me to ask other people ask her if she'd like a date with me. Or, I got the sense that if I didn't get my dad laid, that it was going to be expected that I do it. So I would ask people on dates for my dad. I would wake up. I would wake up sometimes in my bedroom and look through my eyelashes, and I could see my dad's figure in my bedroom. So I started locking my bedroom door. I'm like a normal teenage kid, sort of watching cartoons, laying on the floor, and Dad would throw a magazine down by my head, and he said, "This is an interesting article," and I'd pick it up, and it would be a thing in the back of Penthouse called Forum, and it was a place where people would write in their sexual fantasies, and people were writing in about father-daughter sex, and that it is a social stigma, like it should be allowed, and it's perfectly natural and okay, and and I'm just like, I gotta get the fuck out of here, I am not safe here, I am not safe here, and I am not safe there, 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 and I am not safe there. Like, there is no place I am safe. Mm-hmm. So when I went to the Meadows as a grown-up for anxiety, I'm like, okay, I'm tired of dealing with anxiety. I'm just going to check myself in, and I did, and I had that episode, and I was there maybe a week and a half or something. It's a 5-week program, and they called me into the office, and they said, "You don't need to be here." And I said, "What are you talking about? Like, I am such a fruitcake." And they said, "You could teach here. You could teach here. Like, you don't need to be a client. You need to go."
Wow.
So, and I said, and I'm like, "No," and they said, "Yeah." And they said, "And what you need to do when you leave," I said, "Well, with people with anxiety, you're telling them to get in the elevator or get in the plane or whatever." And they said, "Your anxiety is different. Your panic is from what was done to you." Mm-hmm. And so if you don't want to eat something, don't eat it.
Let's go to that moment where I remember you were talking about a story where your father was going out with a stripper, and she was actually grooming you to become a call girl for somebody she knew. Like, what was that all about?
And she said, "I need to see if you are any good at sex. So take a shower with, whatever his name was, John." That was my first. He had a tremendous amount of rage. So that was my first time having that amount of violence. Is he alive or is he dead? Is he alive or is he dead? And I finally aggravated the nurse enough that she said, "He's dead." 2 of the guys there took turns on top of me. And the second I went through his door, he pushed me, threw me, literally ripped my clothes off, ripped them, didn't pull them off, ripped the clothes off of me, raped me, not as violent as Donna's person, but pretty violent, and said, "That was your first month's rent."